Welcome to my talk. Today I'm going to try and help share what I think is a little bit better understanding of the nature of plagiarism by focusing more on its epistemology and metaphysics, and to try and justify that by showing how plagiarism might not be the traditional ethical issue that we ordinarily think of it as. So, traditionally, when we look at plagiarism, we all generally recognize as one of the founding assumptions that it is a bad thing, and the issue of immediate concern for all of us who are instructors or in some other fashion involved in the educational enterprise, we're worried about catching it, addressing it, and maybe even preventing it in the first place. But the central question to all of that kind of activity is the empirical question of how much do we catch, how much can technological aids or tools help us to catch more with less effort, questions like that. And my goal in the talk today is to try and reorient the conversation a little bit away from those types of concerns to things that might be a little bit more foundational, that this question and its answers presuppose, and to challenge some of those, which will maybe reshape this question or put it in a different context entirely, such that maybe finding an answer to this question isn't as important, or isn't as important in the same ways that you might currently think of it. So to do that, I am going to introduce what is called an Euler diagram, which is cousin to a Venn diagram in that this visually represents possibilities for particular cases. And here, what I've diagrammed are our students. And we can generally, if roughly, sort our students into those who are honest with citations and correctly and appropriately source the material that they use in their work, and those that don't. And I have cut up the universe of possibilities for students neatly into these two possibilities, so I'm deliberately ignoring what might be borderline or edge cases of people who less than perfectly cite material, or who maybe in certain circumstances are plagiarizing to some extent or other, but in other cases are being honest. I'm just ignoring those cases, and I'm also lumping in this diagram those who plagiarize intentionally and those who plagiarize unintentionally. I'm not making those distinctions in this diagram. That would make it maybe a little bit more complicated. I'm trying to zero in on particular things here, so I'm not interested in making those distinctions today. Similarly, so that's that I've cut up our students into those two categories. I've also cut them up into another set of categories that cut across those, and that is students who understand the material and those who don't. And of course, again here, this is highly and unrealistically idealized for general purpose, because we have a large and broad spectrum of understanding in our students, and so it is very rarely, if ever, accurate to say that we have students who know nothing and students who know everything. But we have gradation. But for the purposes of my talk today, I am going to sort them into these two distinct categories and ignore the boundary or edge cases between them, and just dismiss them and say that they're not there for our purposes. So you can reinterpret that as for a particular assignment or course or something like that, that you can neatly, or question that you pose to students, you can neatly sort them into these two rough categories of people who know the answer or know the material, and those who do not. And then over here, this red oval is to represent students who have successfully plagiarized. That is, they have plagiarized and remain unexposed, whereas everybody in the surrounding area here has been exposed. And again, if this was empirically accurate, then the relative sizes of each one of these 6 areas would represent the number of students, the proportion of students who fell into each category, but I'm not making any claims about that in this talk. But what I've done here is I've got the iceberg that I used on the previous slide here to represent those that are visible, those plagiarists who are visible and have been caught, as the tip of the iceberg, and the remaining part of the iceberg is this red area right here. And we currently, because they're unexposed, we don't have a good idea of how many students actually fit in this category. So that's how I'm kind of setting up some distinctions and categories here where students can fall into. And of course, it's an empirical question, as I just said. What proportions of students fall into each category? Are we doing a good job at detecting plagiarism, or are we doing a terrible job in that the tip of the iceberg is quite tiny in proportion to those getting away with it, and that the bulk of those students who attempt plagiarism succeed at it? Those are empirical questions that worry us a great deal. I'm not going to speak to those in this talk. But what I need this for is just those different distinctions, those different categories of student. Because the important question that I want to ask is the ones that we ask when we're worried about the kinds of plagiarism that we do catch and the techniques and efforts that we currently use, and we're wondering whether or not it's possible to improve those techniques, to improve those efforts to catch more plagiarism. And if that's what you're worried about, then it becomes quite important to wonder about the nature of the plagiarism that you currently don't catch. Because your understanding of that plagiarism, that potentially but still as yet uncaught plagiarism, is going to shape your future efforts to catch it quite deeply. And there seem to be, again, 2 distinct possibilities about the nature of that as yet uncaught plagiarism. The first possibility, which I think most people fall into, is to think of all plagiarism, that which we successfully catch and that which we don't, as being pretty much of the same character. That is, the iceberg metaphor, it might be appropriate. The fact that most of it is underwater might be worrying, but it's all ice. And so the limiting factors in our search for plagiarism are simply time and effort. That all plagiarism is essentially the same sort of activity, and that what is limiting us to just the tip of the iceberg is the lack of resources in a particular sense. Whether it's time, whether it's effort, whether it's the subtlety of the plagiarism, that if we invest enough time we can find it, but practically speaking we can't, so the best we might be able to do is catch just a small fraction of it, or employ other measures, technology, automated algorithms to try and catch it for us. All of that is premised on the idea that plagiarism comes in essentially a certain number of known varieties that we have a good handle on, that we know about sufficiently well to be able to identify reliable evidence for it, and that with sufficient effort we can reveal that evidence and determine plagiarists from non-plagiarists. But there's a second answer to that question, and this answer, that the plagiarism that we don't catch is fundamentally different from that we do catch, paints a totally different picture about the prospects for future efforts to combat plagiarism. Because if the lower half, if the underwater part of the iceberg is fundamentally different, And part of the explanation why we don't currently catch that kind of plagiarism is because we're not looking for it in the right ways. That is, we're relying on plagiarism. We're relying on our understanding of plagiarism that we do catch to characterize all of the plagiarism that is out there, and therefore that we are searching for evidence that is relevant to the kinds of plagiarism we currently catch, but that might not be relevant to the plagiarism that currently remains uncaught, then pouring more effort and energy and resources into ever more finely locating and identifying evidence of plagiarism isn't going to bear the same kinds of fruit. Because if it's a fundamentally different kind of plagiarism, there's no guarantee that it will be revealed in the same way, and that might be part of the explanation why it remains as yet unrevealed. It could also be that both of these answers are correct, that to a certain extent some of the underwater ice, some of the lower part of the iceberg, is the same type of plagiarism that we ordinarily catch, but that in certain cases we miss it. And that there are other types of plagiarism that we're not even looking for, or that we don't know how to look for yet. And that's why those are escaping detection. So, but answering these kinds of questions is going to be important to our overall understanding of plagiarism, its role in education and in our classrooms, and in how much we invest, both in time and effort and technological resources, to combating plagiarism. So now I'm going to go back to the Euler diagram, and I'm going to make a change. I'm going to assert right now that one of the strange things that you might have noticed about my earlier discussion using this diagram was that it was very bizarre to be talking about students, that whole category of students who know the material, and involve them in the discussion of plagiarism. That is really weird to think of those students as plagiarizers. But I think that we do have students who do know the material to some degree or other, who still, nevertheless, do plagiarize for a whole variety of reasons. And that sometimes we catch those students and sometimes we don't. At least that's been my experience. I have had plagiarists who fit in the lower part of this who belong in the lower part of this diagram. They were very mystifying to me. But if the answer to the previous slide is option number 2, that some of the plagiarism that we don't currently do well at identifying is fundamentally different than the plagiarism that we do identify, one of the reasons for that might be that the plagiarists, the folks who are doing the plagiarism, are themselves importantly different in that lower part of the iceberg, and the kind of plagiarism that they are doing is fundamentally different. So I'm going to cut the universe of possibilities into 2 and recognize this line and open up the possibility that the folks that fit here and the folks in the surrounding area here are fundamentally different than the folks here or in this part of the red. It might turn out that we're going to rejoin these later, but splitting that opens up the possibility for us to ask questions about whether or not this iceberg is the same as this iceberg. And empirically speaking, it might be the case that the sizes and proportions of these 2 icebergs, for a variety of reasons, are very different. In fact, you might find it reasonable to see that these 2 icebergs as somewhat like the ones that I've depicted right here, that those who are more knowledgeable about the material might be more knowledgeable about successful plagiarism, might be better at plagiarizing because of what they know, and that those knowers, those students who understand material and plagiarize, and get caught will be of a smaller proportion than those who get away with it, as opposed to those who don't have a good handle on the material and attempt to plagiarize. A larger proportion of them might be caught as opposed to successful. That's an empirical question. Here I'm trying to just focus on more philosophical questions about the concepts at hand and making distinctions and asking questions about those distinctions. So we're not going to talk a lot about that because I don't have any data to share about the relative prevalences of plagiarism as correlated, say, with grades of students. But when we look at it like this, when we look at the universe of possibilities like this, we see that we have, at least potentially, 6 distinct categories of students. If we keep the successful plagiarists split like this and make a distinction between them and make a distinction between how knowers exist and how nescients exist. And each one of these 6 groups presents us with a different situation when we're talking about plagiarism. So, to start with, we'll start with a couple easy groups. When we're talking about students who are honest, not plagiarizers, don't know the material very well, and hand in assignments, student work to us, we don't have a problem with those students. Those students are not a problem. They hand in those assignments. We are capable of accurately assessing their degree of knowledge of the material, which might be not very good, and so they're not a problem. In a similar way, those students who don't know the material well attempt plagiarism but are unsuccessful at getting away with it, they also are accurately assessed by us. We are able to, because we catch their plagiarism, we understand that the material that they used in their paper is not their own work. We can correctly attribute to them the degree of understanding they have of the material, which is not great. And so we can accurately assess those students, including the degree of their academic honesty, which might be quite low. This obviously is a problematic group in contrast, right? If a student who doesn't really know the material yet attempts to plagiarize but gets away with it, remains undetected, is in that underwater part of the iceberg, that's where we have real problems. Those folks we have inaccurately assessed as having some degree of understanding of the material that they in fact do not have. And in addition, we have missed the fact that there are ethical issues with those students because they've gotten away with cheating and we haven't seen that. That's the traditional area of concern for people concerned with plagiarism. But let's keep going. The category of students who, generally speaking, know the material and have mastery of it, and who are good citers, that is, they're honest about their citation and use of material that's not their own. Again, no problem with those students. All the folks on the honest side of this Euler diagram, we don't have a problem with. If there are students who, despite the fact that they know the material, attempt to plagiarize and are caught, then again, those folks are accurately assessed as to their degree of knowledge. And in addition, we've diagnosed some ethical issues. That's something that these 2 groups here share in common. When we catch them, we now learn something more about these students' current academic honesty or their current ethical practices, which is a good thing. This last group, though, is a little bit weird and tricky. And that is that it's not the same type of issue as these folks up here. Because if I have a student who knows the material, has chosen to cheat to get some success, and has successfully remained undetected by myself in that attempt, then I am going to assess them as knowing the material. that assessment is going to be accurate because by presumption they belong in this lower half. They are one of my students that has, and to some extent, mastered the material. So my assessment of such students in this category here is going to be accurate, but it's only going to be accurate through luck because they achieved that performance, at least in part, by relying on some cheating. Now they were capable of, or their actual real state of knowledge does fit them into this lower half of the Euler diagram, but that particular performance was the result of cheating. So my assessment of them as belonging in this lower half of the Euler diagram is accurate, but it's only accurate through luck. It's not accurate because the evidence that I used was appropriate or reliable or well-founded. In addition, just like these folks up here, I haven't diagnosed that ethical issue of the plagiarism. So that's a worry. But the thing that I want to point out here, though, is that one difference between these two categories here is that in this case, my assessment is inaccurate. In this case, my assessment is accurate. That's going to become important as we carry on with this talk. And here's the big and challenging and provocative statement that I want to make. After we've seen all of that, and if you have at least somewhat accepted my characterization of plagiarism and how it fits in the universe of possibilities, my claim today is that the only legitimately bad thing about plagiarism that comes from the nature of plagiarism itself is that it undermines assessment. It undermines our assessment of our students' knowledge. All of the other things that we think of as being bads of plagiarism, harms of plagiarism, the things that we spend a lot of time discussing and worrying about and lamenting in the current culture, are not intrinsic to plagiarism itself. They are either externally imposed moral judgments that don't have anything to do with education or with our assessments or even in particular with our students, or they are things that are bad that are derivative of this fundamental wrong, such that if we could address this, then these other harms would also be addressed. So let me explain a little bit what I mean by this so that you can maybe appreciate the controversy a little bit. And that is what I mean by externally imposed moralities. I have a couple examples here. Often we talk about plagiarism as cheating in that it constitutes intellectual property theft. Students are using the words of other people without proper attribution, words or ideas, and that is a wrong. That is bad. And that's a very persuasive argument for those folks who are against plagiarism and want it policed strongly and harshly, that we must discourage this type of behavior because it's bad. But the argument that I want to make today is that this has nothing to do with plagiarism itself or the real reasons that we as educators ought to be disturbed by it and ought to work to eliminate it. They are externally imposed, externally sourced moral judgments that come from outside the educational enterprise. And as partial support for that judgment, there are all sorts of other moral choices that our students make, bad moral choices that our students make, that we don't police in the classroom. That is, I'm sure that you have students who come to class wearing counterfeit clothing, items of some sort, perhaps even stolen clothing of some sort. We don't spend any effort, we don't expend any resources trying to identify those students and correct that immoral behavior. We don't take any of these offenses, whether it's the intellectual property theft of plagiarism or other offenses, criminal offenses that students might have committed, and litigate those offenses in the courts, which we arguably ought to do if they are real moral crimes. This suggests that the nature of plagiarism is not so straightforwardly analogous to actual intellectual property theft, to other similar sorts of crimes, because we don't treat it the same way, and we don't treat other crimes the same way inside the classroom. When someone commits intellectual property theft outside of an educational context, and it's been revealed, they are policed, they are litigated, they are held to account by the legal system. But we don't do that with plagiarism. Now, there might be some of you out there saying, hey, maybe we should, if this analogy is correct and that plagiarism is just one variety of intellectual property theft, then the proper response to it should be similar to that of other instances of property theft. That is, we should criminally litigate. I'm going to disagree with that, as will become clear in the next few slides. But you might think that. But I'm trying to say that the weight of this recognition that we treat plagiarism in a dissimilar fashion to other instances of intellectual property theft or other potential crimes that our students might have committed even while in the classroom, we treat those far differently than we do instances of plagiarism, which suggests that plagiarism is in fact not so similar to those other kinds of crimes, and that folks might have pushed that analogy a bit too far. We also talk about plagiarism a lot and its moral harms as an instance of deception or dishonesty. And of course, all deception and dishonesty is immoral and must be discouraged, and part of our job as educators is to train students to be morally upstanding citizens. And so the deception and dishonesty of plagiarism is something worth addressing, something worth spending time and effort and resources on to try and police and eradicate in our student body. But undercutting that sort of argument are the clear facts that in certain cases we encourage our students to be dishonest and to deceive. And one straightforward case is that we offer creative writing courses. We offer courses in fiction, and we reward students in those courses for being crafty and skillful deceivers and crafting and building false worlds, false assumptions, and writing narratives that help make those look plausible. But we do not see that kind of activity in the same light as plagiarism. That's a different kind of dishonesty. Also, even in those cases where we require students to write nonfiction, that is just plain regular research papers or argumentative papers, we don't require that those papers accurately reflect their true beliefs. That is, when we ask students to write a paper and make sure that it has a thesis that gets well argued for, we do not ask students to sign a statement to the effect that that is their legitimate and authentic point of view that the paper represents. In fact, we encourage, especially in disciplines like philosophy, that students often have the experience of picking a point of view that is not their own and trying to argue for it and exploring how that can work. And so we do not police students on this moral dimension either very consistently. And in fact, there's a couple examples here where we actively discourage students from being honest in certain ways. And so when people use points like these to argue that plagiarism itself, by its very nature, is bad and has moral harms both for the perpetrator and the institution, you might begin to suspect that these are less good arguments than they are post hoc rationalizations of the nature of plagiarism, and that we might have misdiagnosed why it is that we have such strong feelings about plagiarism. That's my point of view. My point of view is that those kinds of arguments, those moral-based arguments, are not legitimate They're not real. They're not the authentic and legitimate reasons why we discourage plagiarism. The real and only reason why we do not like plagiarism is because it undermines our assessment of our students. We do not, in particular, prize honesty, or in particular, in our undergraduate or graduate students, prize their intellectual integrity when it comes to attributing properly the ownership of ideas or words. What is primarily valuable for us in the classroom, in the student-teacher relationship, is that we can accurately assess and give feedback to our students about their learning. And so it's not the theft that matters, it's the fact that we are now being deceived about the attribution of those words and ideas, that we are being led to misdiagnose the source and of those words or ideas and place the credit or blame on the student rather than on the source. And that when we argue that plagiarism is bad because it is deceptive or dishonest, we're really only talking about a very narrow and specific aspect of truthfulness in our students' papers, because we permit a whole range of other deceptive activities and dishonest representations of their knowledge and beliefs without worrying too much about them. So the real bad of plagiarism is simply and only that it frustrates our determinations of student knowledge. That's my argument. And if that's the case, then that can partially explain why we don't worry so much about that region of the Euler diagram where the knowledgeable students plagiarize. That is perhaps regrettable. We do perhaps have some felt burden to help our students develop along moral dimensions as well as intellectual dimensions. We may see that those things as not neatly separable, and that helping students develop intellectually requires some moral development as well. I'm not arguing against that in the slightest. I am saying, though, that we ought to be really clear that there are distinctions to be made between those, and that the real reason why we get worked up about plagiarism is only because it undermines our assessment of that student's work and of their current capabilities. I have a couple other arguments to help bolster my case that this is true. So the first one is a thought experiment. Suppose that all instructors at all levels had a limited form of telepathy, such that you couldn't see people's innermost thoughts and feelings, but that as maybe a side effect of your disciplinary expertise, that you had telepathic access to your students' knowledge of that discipline and the kinds of things that were the subject of the course that you were teaching. So suppose that students had telepathic teachers. In such a situation, in such a circumstance, would those teachers see plagiarism as something as concerning as we do? Would they spend time and effort, as we do, in instructing proper citation practices, in instituting honor codes, in conducting due process for students accused of plagiarism, those sorts of activities that take up quite a significant proportion of our time as educators? I would argue that we would not. That an institution that employed telepathic teachers would have far, far less resources devoted to the policing, the treatment, the awareness of plagiarism in general. Because those teachers would have direct access to their students' current intellectual development, to their current learning, and would be able to provide that accurate feedback to the student. And that the students, whether students did try to borrow other people's words or ideas, that the teacher would not be frustrated in those circumstances with a proper and accurate assessment of that student's state of knowledge. And in those cases, it seems difficult to think that they would care very much about plagiarism, that they would care very much about discouraging it, about instructing students about what it was even, and that it would be more akin to other ethical issues which we really don't care too much about, or even intellectual issues that are not a priority in our classroom. So what I'm saying here is one example might be talking about grammar or Oxford commas or run-on sentences if I am a philosophy professor teaching them about philosophy. Those things I might, in certain circumstances, give students feedback about, but it's not a focus of my course, it's not a priority of my feedback or assessment, so it would be an incidental thing that I might give them feedback on. In the same way, if I was a telepathic teacher and I saw that a student had plagiarized, right, I might think that that was bizarre or odd, or some sort of literary tic that they had, some lack of confidence they had in their way of expressing their own thoughts and ideas, and I might point that out in the same way that I would point out some other kind of grammatical oddity or shortcoming, and say you really ought to think about expressing yourself this way in papers to those people out there who are not telepathic like me and can't directly read your mind when it comes to this material. The important point is that telepathic teachers would see plagiarism as irrelevant to assessment, and because they would see it as irrelevant to assessment, it would occupy far less of their educational world than it does ours. Another hypothetical to entertain here. Suppose that you, a non-telepathic teacher, received a paper from a student that was entirely copied from external sources. But, and I mean entirely, not one original word from the student, but that entirely copied paper was fully and appropriately cited from introduction to the last word in the conclusion. That is, it's a fully, entirely patch-written essay assembled from 5, 6, a dozen different sources, or perhaps just taken entirely from one source, but fully and honestly cited and referenced, such that the student is making it completely transparent where every part of that submission, that assignment, came from. That sounds quite bizarre. Depending on the details of the contents, I could imagine that sometimes one might want to fail that paper, or that one might want to give that paper a very high grade. It depends on the content. But what's clear is that when we're talking about the narrow issue of plagiarism, in this circumstance, there are no ethical issues. The student has correctly cited and referenced that paper. There's no theft of intellectual property. There's no deception happening. All of those issues are fully taken care of. And yet, it's still weird and wrong. And we would want to say, I think, generally speaking, not an acceptable way to go about being a student. But that's only explicable because of the fact that this makes it difficult to assess that student's state of knowledge. It frustrates our assessment, especially if they, for some, in some case, wholesale copied from one single source in a way that was responsive to the assignment prompt or the task in the assignment. It would be very, very unclear how to assess the student's state of knowledge from that sort of evidence. It might be easier if it was extensively patch written from multiple sources, but still might be difficult. It's definitely a different challenge for our assessment than an authentic paper. But clearly, this paper has no ethical issues. So what's going on here? Well, what's going on here is that the real problem is not the student's lack of honesty or dishonesty or their theft of intellectual property, but the effect of those things on our assessments, and that we can find cases where students can be as dishonest, as misrepresentative as they could possibly be, yet that would not be a problem in those particular circumstances where we were telepathic. And we can find cases where students are excessively honest about their citations, and yet those cases are still very problematic for us. Now, I'm hoping that that helps support my case that plagiarism is much less of an ethical problem than we might traditionally think, and has much more to do with the nature and character of plagiarism itself and its interaction with the fundamental purpose of assignments, which is assessment of the student's state of learning. And another way to see that here is to take a look at those different ways of building that Frankenstein paper, that contrast between a single source paper, correctly cited, and an extensively patch-written paper, all correctly cited, but from multiple different sources. And that is to recognize that even in those cases, that instances of plagiarism, in this case, but also in all other cases, can carry substantial evidence of a student's understanding. That is, even if a student entirely writes a paper that is not, quote unquote, in their own words, that paper still can tell us a lot about that student's state of understanding. And that's because even if the student was not responsible for the words or even the ideas that they borrowed and correctly cited in that paper, the one thing that the student cannot relinquish, cannot abdicate to somebody else, is their editorial control of that plagiarized material. They are the ones who are and must be in charge of the choice of that material, how it's integrated into or with the student's own work, if they have partially patch written and they're trying to integrate other folks' words or ideas in with their own, the consistency of concept use between sources or between their own work and cited work, and the incorporation of other people's argumentation into their own uses or tasks. All of those things a student can't abdicate. A student cannot relinquish to somebody else. The most they can do is that most problematic example of entirely plagiarizing from one source, because their editorial control is now shrunk to the minimal but still non-zero amount of picking the single source to use. If they are doing extensive patch writing, though, every particular source they pick, every particular passage they pick, and how they choose to knit it together with other sources and with their own work carries evidence of that student's understanding that we should be able to see as experts in the field. We should be able to see differences between nescients, students who have a poor understanding of the material, and knowers, students who have a very good understanding of the material or even mastery. Those students should perform very differently in patch writing because they'll select different sources, because they will integrate those sources differently with each other and with their own words and their own argumentation. And it's those things that I would argue that we already pay attention to, perhaps not as self-aware as we should, but we do pay attention to those things when we are reading, assessing student work. This is the kind of thing that we pay attention to. This is, I would argue, something that we use to detect a lot of plagiarism. We don't just detect grammatical differences, abrupt changes in tone or style between a student's own work and stuff that they have plagiarized. We also detect a level of understanding, an abrupt change in competence between the student's words and the uncited material from other sources. And that students who don't have a good level of understanding of material are ignorant of those changes, can't appreciate the different levels of competence or comfort or consistency that those external sources have, and how different those sources appear to us when contrasted with their own work, such that that uncited plagiarism jumps off the page to us, but might look grammatically or mechanically indistinguishable from the student's own work. That is, building a Frankenstein's monster, a good one, actually takes skill, and that we are competent to take a look at such monsters and evaluate them accurately such that plagiarism doesn't frustrate that assessment. And so, to kind of wrap up everything I talked about in this short talk, I wanted to argue that a correct, a proper, a rich understanding of plagiarism requires more than just an understanding of the psychological motivations or circumstances of those students, and requires more than an appreciation of the ethical issues surrounding plagiarism, that those are often derivative of more fundamental issues in plagiarism that I think are very much not talked about, and that it would be to our great benefit, both as educators, but in our relationships with our students and our efforts to teach them the value of intellectual honesty, to be upfront and more transparent about this, and to say that ethics, these ethical issues of dishonesty, are not at the core really why educators care about plagiarism. We care about plagiarism because it frustrates our assessment of those students, and it hampers our ability to accurately give them feedback about their current state of knowledge and help them grow. That's the real reason why we care about plagiarism. And if tomorrow we became telepathic, such that we could instantaneously and accurately assess their degree of knowledge and diagnose their deficits and use that information to help target our future teaching, to help repair those deficiencies and promote their skills, then we would not care about plagiarism nearly as much. The positive part of this is to help draw your attention to the fact that when you are engaged in plagiarism detection, when you are putting on your cap as a plagiarism policeman or policewoman, that part of what you're doing might be that kind of, what I'm arguing here is really kind of extraneous and not so important moral policing of your students, but part of it is also that activity of trying to determine whether or not they actually did plagiarize, kind of secondary point, but how well did they do it? Did that act of plagiarism, that act of crafting and bringing in multiple sources, what kind of evidence is that giving you about the current state of knowledge, about their capacity and their competence to do those sorts of things? And so one of my arguments today was to say that how students actually execute their plagiarism attempts can be very revealing and carry a lot of evidence about their current state of knowledge, perhaps in certain circumstances carry as much evidence about their current state of understanding as legitimate, honest work. And so, in sum, to wrap it all up, what I would say is that we ought to see plagiarism as primarily an epistemic issue, an issue about the student's state of knowledge and our diagnosis of that state of knowledge, that is, our states of knowledge about their states of knowledge. That's the most important aspect of plagiarism that we need to focus our energy, our future research on, and not so much the arms race between students and faculty when it comes to executing plagiarism and avoiding detection of plagiarism or correctly prosecuting it. That if we focus on the epistemic aspect of plagiarism, which is its primary and fundamental aspect, that we would much better serve ourselves and our students and the educational enterprise than if we gave ourselves this second job of being plagiarism police. Hopefully this talk was helpful, provocative, and you got something from it. Thank you for listening.